that brings us up to Please Let Me Wonder, and if I recall correctly, that's the beginning of the side to the ballad side, and here's where we get to what many believe was Brian's absolute finest run of songs up to this point, and perhaps that he ever did. This is a gorgeous ballad, a Stone classic. Let's just put it right there. The melody, the delicacy of Brian's lead vocal, and the sensitivity of Mike's vocal on the chorus. Again, we got Brian and Mike tag teaming here, although in reverse, because we got Mike on the chorus and Brian on the verses. Now here we are together. This would have been worth waiting forever. I always knew it'd feel this way. Just lovely, you know, and the way the vocals cascade in the chorus. You know, what can you say? This is in terms of what the Beach Boys did as a ballad band, and what they brought in terms of sensitivity to the arrangements and the production, how it all, the vocals, how it all came together in one package. Right here, you know, this is the culmination of all that. I mean, we've had all these great moments at this point with, you know, with Surfer Girl and The Lonely Sea and Don't Worry Baby. But here, everything is just dialed into an exquisite level of delicacy and sensitivity and lushness that brings forth an emotional response without necessarily. There's a multiplier effect of the vocals and the arrangements to what's actually being said lyrically. I guess that's what I want to say. And you really get that with Please Let Me Wonder. So I'm getting a little ahead of myself because I haven't gone down the musicians. This was one of the earlier sessions that was cut at January 7th at Western. So what's interesting here is you have the Wrecking Crew guys. Carl and Dennis are both on it, although Dennis is, I think, was overdubbed, if I recall correctly. So again, you've got Carl and the Wrecking Crew guys, but Dennis does play on this. He plays congas. Carl's on lead guitar. Brian's on tack piano and the Farfisa organ. Don Randy, Hammond organ, acoustic guitar, Glenn Campbell, Billy Strange, Barney Castle, 6-string bass, Carol Kay, Ron Swallow, our road manager friend again, once again hitting the tambourine. Earl Palmer, rather than Hal Blaine on drums, and also timbales, timpani, and vibraphone, Jerry Williams. Jerry Williams, hold on, I just want to Google him real quick. Jerry Williams, Swedish singer, I think not. Let's disambiguate Jerry Williams here. Jerry Williams Jr. or Swamp Dogg, not that guy. All right, I don't know anything about Jerry Williams. Maybe I'll put something up there. Yeah, but anyway, so we have Jerry Williams as percussion. We have Steve Flass and Jack Nimitz this time on sax. Billy Lee Riley, our aforementioned harmonica player on Help Me Rhonda, is here again. We're not 100% sure what he did here. There's no audible harmonica on this track. He may have been playing guitar or something. Brian and Mike are once again writing together here. Mike was credited originally on the album. It wasn't a retrospective lyric credit, which makes me think that Mike may have brought the lyrics into this track early in the process. There is a different version of the song with different lyrics. But this is such a Brian kind of a lyric. There's so much insecurity here. There was a great, I don't remember which book it was, but one of the early Beach Boys books, when they were talking about this song, had a quote that stuck with me. They said, "This shy teenager isn't about to ask, 'Did you come?'" And I think, even though it's a little bit off color, I think that sums up the song quite well. Because, you know, Wikipedia talks about this song as being lyrically about somebody that is putting their lover on a pedestal and contemplating a romantic act and being afraid to have it be consummated. It's not how I hear this song at all. I hear this song exactly as that writer said. I think this is about the early stages of romance when things are just going into the physical realm for the first time, and there, there's so much on the line there if you're a young person and you're first expressing yourself sexually. And it's so much insecurity, so much vulnerability being in that situation. And I really do think that's what this song is about, in my opinion. I think that nails it. And again, this seems to be, if you think about what was going on in Brian's life at the time, with him being newly married, got a very young wife that almost certainly both sexually inexperienced with relationships. They're working this stuff out emotionally in a very vulnerable place. This seems to be very reflective of where Brian's head was at. So even if Mike wrote the lyrics, and it seems there's no way that he didn't write at least some of them and possibly most of them, this seems to be, again, very reflective of Brian's thinking and some of the things that Brian was going through. Another lyric about Brian's attempt to transition into an emotionally mature adulthood. And it's sad listening to these songs and Pet Sounds also, because you hear Brian trying to make it into adulthood, and he doesn't really get there, with what happened afterwards. And it's tough for me to listen to some of these songs because you hear someone who's a normal 21, 22-year-old going through normal 21 and 22-year-old things, and they're really trying to work this stuff out, and they're really trying to stay on the path that we all have to take to emotional maturity. And it reminds me a little bit of a song by Neil Finn, who's another amazing songwriter, the guy from Crowded House and Split Enz, and it's called Message to My Girl. And Neil Finn wrote it when he was 24, and it's about the same kind of thing where you are coming to a place with your romantic interest where you're getting over your own insecurity and vulnerability, and you're allowing yourself to express yourself emotionally in an honest way. And that song is about making successfully that transition from being a callow, scared young little boy to being a man that can have a relationship. And you hear Brian trying to find his way through this transition all through this album and all through Pet Sounds. And as we know from his personal history, he never makes it. Or you could make the argument he did much, much later. However you want to characterize Brian's journey, there was a development of him as to adult maturity that was ongoing throughout 65 and 66 and reflected on the songs here and reflected on the songs of Pet Sounds. And there's no question that got stunted when Brian backed off artistically. There was a whole personal thing that happened with him at the time. And this is about an attempt to grasp a life for himself that he kind of didn't get to. Now, I mean, he had a marriage with Marilyn that was quite loving, and I think it worked on some levels. I'm not trying to cast aspersions on anything like that, but Brian's own personal journey got stunted. And it just, I know I'm going off on a tangent here and it's a long one, but songs like this just makes me so sad because you hear Brian going through something we all went through and trying to find his beachhead into adulthood. And it's like someone grabbing the rope, and they almost grab it, but they don't quite get there. And you hear him grabbing at this rope on this song, a lot of songs here, a lot of songs on Pet Sounds. I just wanted to call attention to that. It's hard to talk about a song like this because it's so gorgeous. I mentioned a bunch of stuff earlier, but the guitar counterpoint melody on this is really something. We also have, finally, a solo in the solo section, but it's very minimal. I believe that's the Farfisa organ, and it's probably Brian. It sounds like a Farfisa to me, and not the Hammond that Don Randy is doing. In fact, I'm pretty sure that's what it is as I'm playing it back in my head. This is apparently the first song Brian wrote on pot. Again, softer on the edges, like I've been talking about, you can kind of hear that. At 2:25, we get a really nice, very jazz change. Please let me wonder, love. It gets echoed at the very end of the fade. In the last bit, we get a sense of where Pet Sounds is going with the vibes the vibraphone against the layered sax. Brian is starting to do jazz voicings and instrumental combinations that were unheard of in teenage pop music. You did hear it a little bit in the sort of the bossa nova world and what Burt Bacharach was doing, but in terms of a beat band, it's not happening. Now, there's been a big controversy over the years over who says, "I love you." And for many, many years, it was thought to be Carl. It is now pretty well firmly established, and only recently so, it was actually Brian. Marilyn tells the story that it was something that Brian improvised in the studio. He actually asked Marilyn to move into his line of sight from where she was sitting in the control booth so he could direct the "I love you" directly to her when he was singing the song, which is, again, wow, that's just really, really cool. Other writers have made the point that Brian is starting to think now about the instrument and instrument clusters more individually as opposed to a wall of sound. And in other words, with a lot of the things Brian was doing earlier, with doubling the band and doubling elements of the band over and over again, he's trying to emulate that big Phil Spector wall of sound where you've 3 pianos and 2 drums, everything's just thunder. Now Brian's starting to separate the instruments into sections of the arrangement, where in one of his interviews he said, now instead of having a piano and a guitar, you have something that we call a piano guitar, which we're going to call something else. In other words, you take the piano, you take the guitar, you put them together, playing the same instrumental line, you create a third combined sound. This is something that anticipated what happened with MIDI in the 80s, where you were able to layer instrumental synthesizer patches and create a layered sound. Like when you get piano and strings on a keyboard, and you layer the piano and the strings, it's the same concept. So Brian is getting into that idea now where it's not just this big wall of stuff coming at you. You've got a combination of instruments over here doing this melody line, and a combination of instruments over here doing this melody line. You really hear that here. Once again, we got Murray in the booth, snaking his way in. It's going to cause problems later. Brian claimed to have recorded the lead vocal on this in the middle of the night, like 3 or 4 in the morning. The session info doesn't seem to bear him out, so no certainty about what was going on there. But this has been performed live on the Beach Boys reunion tour. Brian's done it solo many times. It's something that does suit where his voice is at now. This song was a watershed. Please Let Me Wonder is just an amazing piece of work. Unassailable. Next we have I'm So Young. This is a cover, albeit another one that gets a layer of Brian innovation over a fairly minimalistic source material. The original history of the song is a little confusing. It was originally done by a band called The Students. Everyone seems to agree it came out in '58, but it didn't hit the R&B chart until '61. I don't really understand that. That may be an inaccuracy on the part of my internet research, but apparently that's the best I could do. It was written by a guy named William H. Prez Tyus Jr. I love that. Prez Tyus. Wrote it. The Ronettes, I guess, did a cover version, and that's how it got on Brian's radar. Although, Brian and Mike were listening to R&B radio in the late '50s, so they might well have heard this on its first go-around as well. This was cut on January 18th, fairly late in the sessions, and this track, we do have the band, unusually for the Beach Boys today. Brian used the guys and not the Wrecking Crew. I gotta think that has something to do with this being pretty late in the game, because I think Brian probably was letting the guys rest. And now this was recorded at January 18th, so the band had been home for a while. They'd had about 10 days to chill out. Now they were getting into the vocal part of things. The band had to come in and do the vocals, so Brian let them cut a track, or maybe they wanted to cut a track, or who knows how this went down. But the lineup for this is Brian on organ and possibly bass. We'll get into that. Al on the primary bass, Dennis on drums, Ron Swallow once again on tambourine, Carl on electric guitar, Mike Love, unusually, was in the studio for the instrumental tracking, which shows you how pressed for time they were at this point, because they were going to go right to doing vocals as soon as they finished cutting this track. That's why Mike was on hand. Again, another really well-produced sonically arrangement, and showing that Brian didn't have to achieve this with the Wrecking Crew. His band could pull this off. Brian's organ comping and the delay effect that's on the track do a lot to establish the vibe, the 50s vibe that the original does with guitar. And so that's where a lot of the sonic character comes from. It has kind of a mystical feel to it. And then, of course, a really beautiful vocal arrangement. Now, I do want to point out that there's a couple of awkward moments on the basic track. The band comes in awkwardly and early at 1 minute and 27 seconds. There's a stop that probably was a visual cue in the studio. That is the reason why it was a little out of time. I think there's a similar thing that happens later in the song, and that just makes me want to point out that when we've talked about the prior records of the band, I have good-naturedly called out some technical flaws on the records, and I say good-naturedly because this was the 60s. You had 3-track recording. People were going to make mistakes, and they were going to make it to the final mix, and I think that's perfectly good. I mean, these days things are too perfect. Every last damn thing is auto-tuned to death, and you never let just a note breathe and let it be itself. So I'm not saying there's anything wrong with this, but I will say that it's noticeable that we have the band back cutting here, and you do hear a few inconsistencies in the track, and it's notable because you have so few of them otherwise. Especially for an album recorded with this technology in this time frame, 1965, this album is technically very well performed and recorded. There are not a lot of mistakes on these tracks. They're pretty damn tight. And this is where you really hear the Wrecking Crew's influence here. It's not that the Beach Boys couldn't cut these tracks. They could. And they did. But when you got the Wrecking Crew in, the tracks tightened up a lot. Now, I've referred to a few times earlier where the Wrecking Crew didn't always nail it, but they were, in those sessions when they weren't nailing it, integrated more with Brian's playing and the other guys playing, and the Wrecking Crew was a little shaky because they were playing with the band, and the band was a little shaky. Now we got the Wrecking Crew cutting these tracks, and these tracks are solid. I'm So Young, a little bit less solid, but props to the band, especially Dennis. Listening to the original tracking sessions, Dennis's drumming really impressed me. He's very solid, especially in the bass drum, and he's dealing with a lot of tape echo in his cans. He's got to do a drum fill that mimics the tape echo. Not the easiest thing to do. Dennis quite solid on this. Al's bass playing a little bit less so, but anyway, the band pulls it off. Brian sings solo on this one, another kick-ass Brian, emotionally emotive vocal. Again, we're getting into the era of just Brian getting right at your heartstrings with his vocals. He had a fairly brief window of that, but 64, 65, 66, 67. What an instrument his lead vocal was. Lovely stacked harmony at the end, and I want to circle around to something as we talk about this. This is another song that they attempted to record earlier when they were on the road. And the original version had a drummer they didn't usually use. His name is strangely missing. Oh, Morris Miller. And there was a flute on it as well. And the original version of this just kind of dragged, partly because of the different drummer, probably. Jazz guy. May have felt it behind the beat, although it sounds to me like there's an overdub tom-tom on the original one too, and that sounds like it's flamming a little bit from time to time. But whatever it is, the flute version, the early version, wasn't really cutting it. But one cool thing about the early version is you can hear the vocals with less reverb, and you can really hear how innovative and interesting the vocal arrangement is on this track. It's a little bit more buried in reverb on the Today version than on the alternate version. Go back and listen for the vocals on the alternate version because, wow, they're really some really nice, what we call substitutions, note choices for the vocals. Very jazzy, very interesting, really, really cool stuff. Speaking of the vocals, great Dennis Descant at the end, playing off mic, "Can't marry no one." Wow, it's a great use of Dennis's voice and the aching quality in his vocal. We're going to get back to this a little bit. Now, one real analogous thing to this track is Carl, who's omnipresent on this record. Even if everybody else isn't there, Carl's always there. Even if Carl's not playing, he's in the booth. He's always there. Carl was there. But he's not on the basic track for this song. Very mysteriously, his guitar part is overdubbed. So if we go back and listen to the original session tapes, we hear Carl is playing. Brian's riding Carl a little bit on how to play it. Carl's sort of saying, "I'm having trouble with it." And Brian's saying, "Just play the top strings," and then they're getting right in. Brian says, "Okay, let's cut one." And you hear Brian go, "Where are you going?" And Carl goes, "I got to go to the bathroom." Carl goes to the bathroom and never comes back. Very strange. So listening on to this, it's clear that Brian's in a hell of a hurry. And this is one of the last, if not the last, I think it is the last, tracking sessions for the album. And they're trying to get the vocals done and then they get back out on the road or whatever they're going to do. So Brian's really pushing it. And it seems clear to me that that Brian's covering most of the chords with his organ part. And Brian makes an unspoken decision that however long Carl's going to be in the bathroom, he's going to get this track cut and Carl can just overdub his shit later, which he does. Carl's in the bathroom for, by my count, 12 minutes. And and at one point Al asks if Carl's going to play or not. During this session, you hear Brian writing Dennis a good bit, saying, "You don't listen to me, Dennis. You would have got it if you listened." And then you hear Dennis go, "Yeah, sure." So there's I can tell, because Mike shows up at the session, which, as I said before, means they're going to be going to doing vocals as soon as they got this track cut. And we've got the band back in the studio after working with the Wrecking Crew for a couple weeks. And Brian just sounds very impatient. He's probably at this point quite used to dealing with the more experienced musicians, maybe a little frustrated at being back with the group. Yeah, Carl doesn't come back. 12 minutes, the tape runs. Al asks if Carl's coming back, and Carl never comes back. Well, the question is, what was Carl doing in the bathroom for more than 12 minutes? And we must agree, some Beach Boys mysteries just should remain mysteries. A couple other random things about I'm So Young. There's one point where the 6-string counterpoint coming down nearly gets crosswise of Dennis's drum rhythm with all the tape echo and everything, but it works out. There's some question who does the overdub bass, the do 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 do, whether it was Al or Brian. It's really 50-50 on who it was. It was an overdub. Brian usually did those kind of overdubs, probably Al wasn't playing super tight. So if Brian wanted to get it done quickly, you could see him doing it himself. However, it is done with a pick, which Brian didn't usually play with, although he did occasionally. And also Al was already playing the 6-string bass, so one would expect Al to keep on the bass. Bottom line is, this might be another bass appearance by Brian on the album, but we don't know. It might have been Al. All right, so that puts us into Kiss Me Baby. Another Brian and Mike co-write. Another lovely vocal performance by Mike and Brian. They start in a lovely unison, then I guess the whole band comes in on the whole unison thing. Really kind of unusual for the band to sing in unison, although they did do it once in a while. Of course, on Graduation Day, they did that. You hear Mike display extraordinary sensitivity as a vocalist on this album. This is another song where he does a lovely job. So, this you hear, again, even though this album is very much Brian's show in terms of the arrangements and the songwriting and Brian's vocals and everything, some of Mike's best work as a lyricist and as a vocalist you can hear here. If you want to make an argument in Mike's favor, there's a lot of grist for that mill on this album. This was tracked, intriguingly, just prior to Brian's breakdown in that short window of time we were talking about on the prior episode when the band was in LA. In fact, it may have been as early, as late as the night before or just a day or two before. So it wasn't the night before, but it was very, very close to the point where Brian first refused to go out on the road. And Craig Slowinski theorizes that it was this session where Brian's arranging first kind of gets into that groove with the Wrecking Crew that we hear all through this album, where the tracks just really blossom. That Brian may have just said, screw it. You know, I mean, he's been trying to cut this album all year in dribs and drabs when he's in the town for a couple of days or when he's on the road, and he's only gotten a couple of tracks out of it. Now he's finally home. He's finally got a little time. He's finally sitting down with the instruments that he wants, and voila, there's his sound. And Craig theorizes this is the point where Brian mentally goes, I'm done with this crap. And he may well be right. This is the only song on the album where nobody from the band plays on it. This is the only one. Every single track has at least Carl and usually Brian and Carl. Carl's there. I'm sorry, Brian does play piano on it. I shouldn't have said that. But nobody else from the band is on the track. Carl is in the booth, but apparently not doing anything. Leon Russell Tack, piano, acoustic guitar, Barney Kessel, Bill Pittman, electric guitar, Billy Strange, bass, Carol Kay, six-string bass, Ray Pullman, Julius Wechter on Beltry and Vibes, Hal Blaine, drums and woodblock, French horn and English horn, Peter Christ and David Duke, sax is Stephen J. again. Now the English horn, when you hear that descending sound that goes with the guitar. Remember I was talking earlier about you have the guitar and the piano and they form a new sound. Here it's a guitar and something that sounds like an oboe or a bassoon. That's actually this thing called an English horn that goes da 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 with the guitar. So that's an example of Brian combining unusual instruments to get the sound again. Brian would use the English horn again, I believe on Summer's Gone, some much later track from the reunion album. He uses that again. This song, again, we were talking previously about Brian trying to get this stuff together on the road. This song apparently was composed in a beer hall in Europe, in either Amsterdam or Copenhagen. There is a story about Brian commandeering a piano in a beer hall, and also him getting really drunk and going on about how amazing Audrey was. Really cool doo-wop influence on the counterpoint vocals, and you have a really nice little buried vocal chant, kiss a little bit, fight a little bit. This is clearly a production that meant a lot to Brian. There is a documentary, a videotape of him breaking down the multi-tracks much later in life and talking about the instrumental combinations he used to make the track and having a very clear memory of them. So again, in support of Craig Slowinski's theory, this seems to have been a really pivotal production for Brian, something that meant a lot to him and may indeed have motivated his decision to leave the road. Although certainly that was a cumulative situation, but this may have been the breaking point. And yet another outstanding ballad coming up. This one of my personal favorites, She Knows Me Too Well. This was tracked in the middle of '64, one of that round of sessions around When I Grew Up to Be a Man. In fact, it was the B-side for that. It may have originally been attempted to be the B-side for Little Honda. Carl, I think we're done with you. It apparently was originally going to be the B-side to Little Honda. This is the band playing. So we have, I think, 3, maybe 4 songs. I think it's 4 songs on this album that primarily the full band. Brian on piano, Carl on guitar, bass Al, drums Dennis, and then Russ Titleman hitting a mic stand with a screwdriver. Russ Titleman had a brief period where it looked like he might become Brian's new collaborating partner. He co-wrote Guess I'm Dumb, which we're going to talk about in a little bit, which was a song that Brian gave to Glenn Campbell. Another song that is was not completed until I think the Imagination album, some later solo record. Brian did a song with Russ Titleman called Sherry, She Needs Me, with some very questionable lyrics. It's probably one we need to get into in one of the bonus episodes. But anyway, Russ Titleman had quite a career in music. He did a lot of different things, including at this time being the rhythm guitar player in the TV show Shindig's House Band. He later, of course, would go on to become vice president of Warner Brothers, produce records for Randy Newman and many others. So he's hanging around Brian at this time, doing a little writing with him. He met Brian through Lou Adler, their mutual friend and record producer. This is another song where Mike Love apparently had something to do with the lyrics, but boy, this is Brian all the way in terms of what's being said, what's being thought about. It's an amazingly honest, confessional, and emotionally deep and honest lyric. Think about having a lyric like, sometimes I have a weird way of showing my love. First of all, at this time, and then think about how we think of a lyric like that retrospectively. That's putting a lot out there, saying things like that. And Brian's just being very straight up here. And the level of self-awareness and self-assessment here, again, it's tough to hear because you see a certain amount of that kind of vanish from Brian's the way he writes about things. He's grappling with himself and his failings and his attempts to kind of step up to the plate as a romantic partner and as an adult. And he's very honest. This is almost like that John Lennon song in the Beatles, "It's Getting Better. I used to be mean to my woman, beat her and kept her apart from the things that she loved." I mean, that's pretty hardcore honesty from somebody that's behaved very badly. Now, obviously, this isn't that bad, but he does talk about a certain level of emotional abuse in this song, quite honestly. And it's brave. And you can hear a guy that's really just grappling with a lot. Yeah, I'm sure Mike had something to do with it, but I can't believe that the tenor of the lyrical thought was Mike's. And you saw this on Pet Sounds, where Tony Asher wrote the bulk of the lyrics, but Brian gave him what he wanted to be said, to be talked about, to be written about. There's a line in here that's always been a little puzzling to me, and it's talking about jealousy. When I look at other girls, it must kill her inside, but it'd be another story if she looked at the guys. I assume what that means is, she's upset Brian's looking at other women, but he would lose his marbles if she did the same to him. There's a double standard there. I have to say that the lyrical couplet's a little unclear. Maybe it was clear at the time, but I think that's what's being said. But once again, what a brave and unusually frank assessment of male insecurity, and not putting it on the woman. I mean, this is I can't call it a feminist tune because it's all about a guy owning his stuff, but it's very sort of in awe of the level to which the female in the relationship is an unequal partner, and how much more she's bringing to it emotionally, and there's a great level of respect here and of self-flagellation. This is the kind of thing I don't think people would dare write today, because we are so sensitive to these negative manifestation of these kind of emotions of jealousy and sort of soft abuse that not exclusively but often come from men, especially young men. There's a bravery to owning up to this and talking about this here that I think is useful. Because I'm not saying it's right or it's good. It's not, but it is normal. It's very common. And this is a way, I think, for him to exercise this and try to deal with it. And this is what art does. It's funny because this album is rightly celebrated for its musical innovation and its sound of its tracks. But lyrically, there's a lot going on here, I think, that needs to be respected. And Brian and Mike, however they arrived at this, they did a really good job navigating a certain type of subject matter that's tough to talk about. Yeah, the music certainly complements the lyrics, and you can hear this in the intro, which is very kind of ominous. Goes that minor, kind of falls back on a minor. She knows me. It's almost like a creepy horror movie kind of a thing, and she knows me like she's already kind of gotten into a frightening, emotionally vulnerable place in my heart. She knows his weaknesses. She also knows his strengths well enough to forgive his weaknesses. Right there. And then you have a really nice verse melody, again, a very expansive, a very broad sounding backdrop. And then you get to the chorus, and one of Brian's most gorgeous melodies. She knows me too well. That's something that Eric Carmen stole on a number of songs, and with good reason, because it's just a gorgeous soaring falsetto melody, one of his best, and you put the right amount of reverb on it, not like you just got from me, and it just, again, right at the heartstrings. And Brian just is such a good and expressive vocalist at this point. It really sounds like he's going to break into tears at the end of the second chorus. One other thing worth mentioning is this: at 2 minutes and 16 seconds, Dennis goes for a drum roll that he really shouldn't have gotten away with, and he did. I don't know how he did it. Another Stone classic. This song is one of my very, very favorites, as is the next one, In the Back of My Mind, an extraordinary track. This is a song that opinions are a little divided on. I mean, I don't think anyone hates it. Some people think this is just a little too much, a little too weird, a little too much orchestration, a little too far off the band's bailiwick sonically. But I think this is an outstanding track. So as I said, this is a really unusual track because there's really a full-blown orchestra. In fact, Brian was back at Capitol Studios for the first time in a long time, for reasons that are unclear, but maybe it was because of this almost big band sound that he was going for. But you have a huge, very, instrumentally, this is a lot closer to something you hear from Frank Sinatra or Nat King Cole or something like that. And the way it's almost a radical composition. You've got so many different things going on, so many interesting changes. And while I'm talking about that, let's get into the writing here. Brian and Mike, again, writing together, but honestly, we've talked about Mike's greater or lesser level of input. It's hard to imagine this song having much Mike in it. This really sounds like Brian. And again, this is a song very frankly owning up to insecurity and the level of terror that Brian seems to be feeling, being this emotionally vulnerable for the first time with his new wife. There's no Mike Love swag here. And Brian very significantly gives this vocal to Dennis. Now, Brian seems to be making an effort to give Dennis more vocal featuring around this time. And Brian expressed frustration for many years afterwards at Dennis's performance, because Brian clearly loved the track. And the Dennis is very loose on the double tracking. You can hear it come apart. Double tracking being something the guys regularly did, where you sing the vocal and then you sing it again as close to in sync to the prior vocal as you can to get a thicker, lusher sound. Dennis could not get those two performances in sync, so it's pretty rough around the edges. But what a vocal! First of all, it's a really demanding melody, and many kudos to Dennis to being able to navigate it at all. And the level of the way his voice is a little bit erratic. It kind of pushes here and pulls there. It's a little loud and plays a little quiet, but there's so much personality to it. There's thought behind it. It's not just a random performance like when he gives this little chuckle towards the end. He's also thinking about the delivery of the song. There's a lot of respect, both for the the sort of jazz influenced arrangement and for Brian's composition and how Dennis approaches it. You can tell he's given it his all. And when you get to the place where the orchestra at the end starts to come apart, I mean, there's this extraordinary ending where the orchestration just starts to descend out of nowhere, like falling through a trap door into a pit of despair, and then smashing into little pieces when it hits the bottom and the instruments all sort of float away in different directions. That's what the music characterizes. And over this you hear Dennis go, "It'll always be." And the way he punches that note, the stress, the pain in it, nobody else in the band could have sung it like that. And Dennis, for all the imperfections of the vocal, sells the hell out of this track. I mean, just wow. So I mean, this is one of my very favorite moments. It's one of Brian's riskiest compositions, both emotionally and in terms of how extraordinary it is compositionally. Just goes all over the place, and Dennis just taking that ball and running with it. And we've, again, just as we saw with Al earlier with Help Me Rhonda, for the first time we see what Dennis is capable of as a vocalist. He's not just the guy that's going to punch through with a song like Do You Want to Dance? He can really bring an extraordinary level of sensitivity to emotionally vulnerable material. And we would soon find out that actually was his strongest suit. I didn't get into who played on it. Carl is on lead guitar, so we have Carl here again. Don Randy on organ, auto harp, Tommy Tedesco, Bill Pittman, acoustic guitar, Billy Strange, tremolo guitar, Carol Kay, bass, Leon Russell, vibraphone, Hal Blaine on woodblock and paper cups, presaging his peculiar instrumental work on Caroline No. Saxes again, Steve Plass and Jay. This track took 40 takes. And unsurprisingly, I mean, the melody, chord progression, and string arrangement on the bridge are just jaw-dropping. I talked before about the ending. This also, you have this really cool, another descending cadence on the bridge section. And here we see another debut, because we've got Carl on the backing vocals. This is the only place in the album where we don't have group lead vocal or group background vocals, but we do have Carl and probably Brian doubling Dennis on the "I try to run far away, the things I should try to keep away." First of all, great melody with da 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 da, and navigating once again. Brian's threading that needle of a melody over a really unconventional chord progression, but making it work. But for the first time, we hear that sweet Carl tone that we would start to see more and more on the records that would become a trademark of the band's later work. We haven't really heard that from Carl until now. Carl's had a few vocal turns. They've been pretty pedestrian, but here we have the softness and the sensitivity of Carl's vocals. So that comes through on the bridge section. And so for the first time, we're seeing what the younger Wilson brothers are gonna bring to the table as lead singers moving forward as Brian starts to recede into the background. You hear that coming together right here. Some overtly jazz touches, which I think rub some people the wrong way because it gets a little too far in the supper club territory. The swinging sax, doo 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 doo, and some of Dennis's flourishes maybe go a little too far towards the hey. So yeah, you could argue that there are a couple places in this song that get a little too far in the supper club area, but I would argue no, it's just respecting the source material of this music. Brian actually re-recorded this in 1975, and around that time the band, for the first and last time, tried doing it live with Dennis fronting the band. Brian's 1975 recording is notable for being the last gasp of his old singing voice before it went into sort of laryngitis-ridden mid-period voice. This was sort of a legendary outtake track for a long, long time, and it finally got released as a bonus track on something recently. I don't remember what it was, but yeah, in the back of my mind, one of my personal very, very favorite tracks, and an extraordinary thing. So that brings us to the last track, Bull Session with Big Daddy, where we go, WTF, why? Like, suddenly we've had this amazing artistic progression, and then we get the guys chowing down food with a random journalist talking about their recent trip to Europe. So it should be noted that if pretty much every Beach Boys album up to this time had some kind of blatantly filler track. And so it was almost like a tradition. But there was one other song that was around it the band could have put on here that was right in of a piece with the level of art that we've got in Beach Boys today. And that's Guess I'm Dumb, which was co-written by Brian and Russ Titleman. And a track for that had been done in '64, I think in October. And there was a little bit of singing done on it by the guys. Carl's on it, and Marilyn was also on it. And according to Brian, it was intended for the Beach Boys Today album, but nobody in the band wanted to sing it. Perhaps because of saying "Guess I'm Dumb," it wasn't something they wanted to sing. I guess I'm dumb. That was Brian's theory. There's some question as to whether this was ever intended for the Beach Boys, though. This is Brian's recollection. However, there's some evidence against this. The Beach Boys are not on the original session sheet. Also, Marilyn is audibly on the backing vocals, and unless this was just kind of a placeholder thing, that wasn't unheard of, but that was unusual. So for Brian and Marilyn and Carl to do the backups instead of the full band sort of implies maybe it was intended for somebody else, but nonetheless, it was eventually given to Glenn Campbell as a thank you for his work subbing for Brian around this time on the road. It was released as a single in the middle of '65, went nowhere, and that's a shame because of all of Brian's outside productions, it's one of the very finest. Glenn knocks it out of the park utterly. So it's really hard to find fault with the final result. But boy, if we'd had Guess I'm Dumb in the place of Bull Session with the Big Daddy, with perhaps Carl singing it, wouldn't that have been nice, to quote Brian? But we didn't get that, and we have Bull Session with Big Daddy. Why we have an interview on here, I don't know. Maybe it was an attempt to sort of, after this adventurous record, bring everybody back to the base personalities of the band, reassure everybody it's the same bunch of guys here. Significantly, this was done on January 3rd. The band had just gotten back from the road. Brian had just had his breakdown, but he had not yet told him that he was leaving the live band for good. So it's an interesting document of a little pause in their history. They're talking about the recent European tour. Brian, of course, the only thing he says he notices was the bread, so it's all about food for him. You know, Eiffel Tower, Taj Mahal, whatever. There's a couple of interesting things about this. Al's not there, so but Marilyn is, and she's brought everybody food. And I really like the easy familiarity with which the band deals with Marilyn. You can already tell Carl and Marilyn have developed a bond. Someone sings "Everything Gonna Be All Right, Marilyn," which is a takeoff of a recent hit song, "Everything's Gonna Be All Right This Morning," and I think that's Carl and not Brian, although I'm not 100% sure about that. Brian early on tries to establish order in this interview, which, by the way, is with a magazine journalist named Earl Leaf. I'll put more about him up here. Brian tries to establish order. Quickly, he gets run over, and the interview proceeds. There's a famous exchange between Brian and Mike where Brian says, "I haven't made a mistake my whole career," and Mike says, "Brian, we keep waiting for you to make a mistake." So much there. Brian has hardly anything to say about Europe, but he has to talk about a Capitol Records employee named Dick Rising. One has to wonder. Apparently there really was a Dick Rising, but you got to think that's the reason Brian called him out, and it wasn't because of his service to the Beach Boys. There's a really interesting little bit buried into this where Earl Leaf says to Carl, "Hey, Carl," and you hear Carl mumble, "Yeah, get out of here." But then once he's pressed to speak, gives a very thoughtful response. And Carl is one of the most interesting and most unknown people in the Beach Boys history. And one of these days, I think I'm going to do a show that sort of pieces together all the little things I've learned about Carl over the years. Nothing too personal, but one of the things you see about Carl is he had the player goes, "Yeah, get out of here." He had a kind of a contrary streak that but and you see it come out here in just this little bit of like, "I don't want to talk to you" kind of thing. And he also clearly didn't like being in the spotlight. He didn't do a lot of interviews, but when he was pressed to do an interview, he always had a lot of very thoughtful, careful things to say. I mean, Carl Wilson interview is usually a bit of a treasure if he's in the mood to talk. But I love this little moment where at first he just tells him to get lost, and then when forced to speak, he actually has some very nice and thoughtful and sweet things to say. Dennis also at the end talking about Shindig. Dennis is surprisingly often the most articulate of the three Wilson brothers. You wouldn't think he was, but he seems to be the one most comfortable talking and has the most to say quite often as we look through the band's history, right up till the end. So interesting thing about Dennis. One wonders why they picked this particular set of stuff because there was originally a 20-minute tape, and they edited it down to these 3 minutes, and one wonders why they picked these 3 minutes of talking about a pig's head or a lamb's head on a plate, and Brian not liking anything but the bread, and tapering off on Dennis talking about Shindig. It's kind of a curious selection of things to focus on. And that pretty much wraps it up for the album. There was one outtake done around this time called All Dressed Up for School. It deserves a little bit of mention. They, again, attempted to record this on the road. The available versions out there pretty much feature just the band, even though there were some Wrecking Crew involvement. You can't really hear them on the final mixes. I don't know why it's done like this, but again, it has that same quality that the original Dance, Dance, Dance has. It sounds very demo-y. The band plays competently, but not in really a driving way. But interestingly, Carl sings the lead vocal, and Al does Brian's falsetto, except for one line on a counterpoint that Brian does seem to sing. But you hear Al singing falsetto uniquely on a studio track, sounding very like Bruce would sound, interestingly also. The track is sort of a mix of Louie Louie and Papa Ooh Mau Mau with some pretty direct references to both. Carl given the vocal a little sass, and the song actually is a little bit racy by 1964 standards, which is probably why they didn't use it. But bits of the song were recycled later into I Just Got My Pay, and also parts of it into Heroes and Villains. There's some interesting Al wandering on the bass. At least Al's calling attention to his bass playing a little more than he usually does. So a little more Al and Carl featured than we usually hear. So it's interesting curio for that reason, but sort of a minor track otherwise, and never mixed properly in my opinion. And that's pretty much it. I mean, I have talked endlessly about this record. I imagine I'll split this into 2 or even 3 parts. But I think the record deserves this level of attention. It is simply a fine work. Much has been discussed about the musical innovation on it, and quite rightly so. Lyrically, it's also one of the deepest things the band did, especially in the earlier days. And again, quite remarkable as we hear Brian, newlywed, in his first really, really serious relationship of his life, and changing his lifestyle from being constantly on the road to being somebody that's in a committed relationship and starting a family. The level of emotions that he and Mike were able to conjure up and match them to this very deep, resonant, and lush instrumentation and adventurous arrangements. This is justly regarded as one of the Beach Boys' very, very finest records. Beach Boys today. I'll see you next time, where we're going to be doing something a little different for the next episode, so stay tuned. And again, remember, we do have a Patreon and a place to contribute if you want to keep these shows going. Look at the first comment on the box. I'm Adam Marsland, and I'll see you in the next episode.